What if the place most people dream about is quietly becoming a place others go just to survive? When you picture Hawaii, you probably see turquoise water stretching endlessly into the horizon, luxury resorts perched perfectly along the coastline, and sunsets so vivid they almost look artificial. You imagine peace, escape, a version of life untouched by struggle. But let me ask you something. What if just a few steps away from those postcard-perfect views, there's a completely different reality unfolding? One that most visitors never notice, or choose not to see. On the island of Oahu, tents now line parts of the shoreline. At first glance, it might look like an adventurous camping scene, families spending the night by the ocean, travelers chasing a different kind of experience. But look closer. These aren't tourists. These are people with nowhere else to go. And here's the part that stops you in your tracks. The numbers haven't just increased, they've exploded. Just over a decade ago, the homeless population here hovered slightly above 1,000. Today, it's pushing toward 5,000. So the question becomes unavoidable. How did one of the most beautiful places in America turn into a destination for survival? And maybe even more unsettling, why are people coming here in the first place? To understand this, you have to step beyond the image of Hawaii as paradise and into the daily reality of living there. Let's start with something simple, but critical. Hawaii is one of the most expensive places to live in the United States. Everything costs more: housing, food, gas, healthcare. Even the smallest daily necessities carry a price tag that feels disproportionate. Now imagine trying to survive here without a steady income. Imagine waking up every morning not knowing where your next meal will come from. Imagine watching tourists spend in one afternoon what you don't have in a month. Imagine living in a place designed for comfort, while you're struggling just to exist. For thousands of people on Oahu, this isn't imagination, it's reality. Some sleep in tents pitched along the beaches. Others stay in cars parked in quiet corners of the island. Some build makeshift shelters hidden in vegetation, trying to stay out of sight while still being part of a world that seems to have moved on without them. At first glance, you might assume these are mostly locals, people born and raised in Hawaii who have been pushed out by rising costs. And yes, that's part of the story. But it's not the whole story. Because when researchers and local authorities started looking deeper, they discovered something unexpected. A significant portion of the homeless population didn't start their lives here. They came from somewhere else. Pause for a moment and think about that. Why would someone already struggling financially choose to travel thousands of miles to one of the most expensive places in the country? It sounds irrational, until you shift your perspective. Picture someone living on the streets in a cold state. Winter isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. Freezing temperatures turn every night into a risk. Frostbite, hypothermia, illness, survival itself becomes uncertain. Now compare that to Hawaii. Warm weather year-round. No snow. No freezing nights. No brutal winters threatening your life while you sleep. Suddenly, the logic changes. For someone with no home, Hawaii doesn't look like a luxury. It looks like a safer place to survive. But that raises another question. If the situation is growing this serious, wouldn't everyone notice? The answer is yes, and that's exactly what's happening. Unlike sprawling mainland cities, islands don't have the luxury of hiding their problems. Space is limited. Life unfolds in the open. Beaches, parks, sidewalks, they're shared spaces. Even a small increase in homelessness becomes highly visible. And on Oahu, the increase hasn't been small. Encampments are appearing in public areas, sometimes uncomfortably close to tourist hotspots. Places once known purely for relaxation are now layered with a different kind of reality, one that visitors weren't expecting. For locals, this shift is impossible to ignore. And understandably, it's creating tension. Put yourself in their position. You live in a place where tourism isn't just an industry, it's the backbone of the economy. Your income might depend on visitors feeling safe, relaxed, and willing to spend. Now imagine those same visitors encountering visible poverty, tent communities, and signs of struggle just outside their hotels. What happens then? Do they come back? Do they tell others to visit? Or do they quietly choose somewhere else next time? This is the dilemma many residents are facing. It's not just about compassion, it's about survival from another angle. Concerns about safety, public image, and economic stability are growing. Conversations that once stayed in private are now happening openly. And these concerns aren't entirely unfounded. Because homelessness rarely exists in isolation. It often brings with it a chain reaction of other challenges. Mental health issues, addiction, lack of access to healthcare, and a constant state of instability that makes recovery incredibly difficult. And this is where the story begins to take a darker turn. For years, methamphetamine has been one of the most common drugs associated with homelessness in Hawaii. It's fueled addiction, strained families, and overwhelmed support systems. But recently, something even more dangerous has entered the picture. Fentanyl. A synthetic opioid so powerful that even a tiny amount can be deadly. As it spreads, overdose cases are increasing. Emergency responses are becoming more frequent. And with every statistic, there's a human story behind it, a life that didn't go the way anyone expected. Now ask yourself, what happens when addiction collides with poverty, in a place with limited resources? The answer isn't complicated, but it is troubling. Desperation grows. And when desperation grows, so does the likelihood of crime. Not necessarily violent crime, but survival-driven actions. Theft. Break-ins. Petty offenses that stem not from intent to harm, but from the need to get through another day. In some parts of Hawaii, this pattern is already emerging. And as it does, public frustration increases. Residents begin to feel caught between empathy and fear. They understand the human side of the crisis, but they also see the impact on their communities, their families, and their livelihoods. So the question becomes even more complicated. How do you balance compassion with stability? How do you help those in need without allowing the situation to spiral further? Surveys across the state show that many residents now consider homelessness one of the most pressing issues facing Hawaii today. But numbers alone don't capture the full picture. On Oahu alone, around 4,500 people are currently without permanent housing. And nearly two-thirds of them are living outside shelters, on the streets, in tents, or in vehicles. That's not a temporary spike. That's a pattern. Over the past decade, the number of unsheltered individuals has nearly doubled. And behind every number, there's a story. A man who lost his job during an economic downturn and couldn't keep up with rising rent. A woman who escaped a difficult situation only to find herself with nowhere to go. A veteran struggling with trauma that never fully healed. A young person who aged out of the system with no support network to rely on. Each one arrived at this point differently. But they all ended up in the same place. And that brings us back to the question that started it all. Why here? Why Hawaii? Part of the answer lies not just in climate, but in perception. For many people on the mainland, Hawaii represents hope. Even in hardship, it feels like a better place to be than where they currently are. But hope can be misleading. Because arriving in Hawaii without resources doesn't solve the problem, it often makes it harder to escape. There are limited shelters, limited affordable housing options, limited space to expand. And being on an island means there's no easy way out. You can't just leave and start over somewhere nearby. You're surrounded by ocean. And that isolation changes everything. It turns a difficult situation into a trapped one. So what happens next? Efforts are being made, government programs, outreach initiatives, housing projects, but progress is slow, and the scale of the problem is overwhelming. Some policies aim to relocate individuals into shelters or temporary housing. Others focus on clearing encampments from public areas. But these solutions often raise more questions than answers. If you clear an encampment, where do the people go? If shelters are full, what options remain? If the root causes, high costs, limited housing, addiction, mental health, aren't addressed, can the cycle really be broken? And perhaps the most difficult question of all. Is this a local issue, or a national one? Because when people are traveling across states to survive in Hawaii, it suggests something deeper, a system that isn't working elsewhere either. Hawaii isn't creating the problem. In many cases, it's receiving it. And that shifts the conversation entirely. It's no longer just about one island or one state. It's about a broader reality, one where economic pressure, lack of affordable housing, and social challenges are pushing people to their limits. Hawaii just happens to be where those pressures become visible in a way that's impossible to ignore. Because here, the contrast is stark. Luxury resorts stand just minutes away from tent communities. Tourists sip drinks by the beach while others search for their next meal nearby. Two completely different worlds, existing side by side. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So the next time you think about Hawaii, ask yourself, what does paradise really mean? Is it just the view? Or is it the ability to live without fear, without uncertainty, without having to choose every day between food, shelter, and dignity? Because for thousands of people on Oahu, paradise is not a vacation. It is not a postcard. It is not a place where time slows down and worries disappear. For many, it is simply the place where survival feels a little more possible than anywhere else. And that reality changes everything, because once survival becomes the central question, every other part of life bends around it. Where do you sleep tonight? Where do you charge your phone? Where do you keep the only belongings you have left? And if you lose those two, what exactly is left? That is why this story is so unsettling. Hawaii is famous for its beauty, its beaches, its luxury resorts, its sunsets that seem almost unreal. But behind that image lies another reality, one that is far less comfortable to look at. A growing number of people are living in cars, tents, shelters, and improvised encampments, trying to hold on to basic stability in one of the most expensive places in the United States. How can a place known around the world for comfort and escape become a place where so many are forced to fight for the bare minimum? So now we have to ask a bigger question. Then there are the moments when the numbers stop being steady and suddenly explode. Take the 2023 Maui wildfires, for example. Entire communities were destroyed. Neighborhoods vanished. Homes, businesses, schools, and memories were reduced to ash almost overnight. Thousands of people lost everything in a matter of hours. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the place you called home no longer exists. Where do you go when there is nowhere to return to? Where does a family begin after losing the roof over their heads, their savings, their neighborhood, and in many cases, the sense that life will ever feel normal again? For a period, homelessness numbers nearly doubled. Although they later stabilized, the fires exposed something deeper than a disaster. They revealed how fragile the system really is. One shock, one tragedy, one catastrophe, and the margin of safety disappears. The event was not just a wildfire. It was a warning. How many communities are actually one crisis away from the same fate? Now let's return to one of the most controversial questions in this entire story. Are people being sent to Hawaii? You may have heard claims that other states are shipping homeless individuals to the islands. It is a powerful idea, one that immediately captures attention and fuels outrage. It suggests a hidden policy, a deliberate strategy, a kind of passing the problem move that sounds almost too cynical to believe. But is it true? The reality is more complicated. Across the United States, there are programs designed to help homeless individuals relocate, usually to places where they have family or support systems. Cities like San Francisco and New York have used such programs for years. The logic is straightforward. If someone has a sister in another state, or a parent willing to help, or a job opportunity waiting somewhere else, then relocation might offer a better path than leaving them stranded in the same cycle of instability. In theory, it is not about dumping people somewhere else. It is about reconnecting them with support. But does a practical solution always feel humane in real life? And when people are desperate, who gets to decide what counts as help? Here is the key detail. There is no solid evidence showing that states are officially sending people to Hawaii. Most relocation programs are targeted, not random. They are not secret pipelines funneling people across the ocean. The story is not as simple as, they were sent there. In fact, simplicity is usually the first thing to disappear when you look closely at homelessness. There are layers of economic pressure, family history, mental health struggles, addiction, trauma, job loss, and housing costs all tangled together. And when people ask the wrong question, they often miss the real one. Not, who dumped them here? But, why was Hawaii already so vulnerable to begin with? So if that is the case, how are people ending up there? The answer is surprisingly straightforward. They go on their own. Some manage to save enough for a plane ticket. Others use temporary funds, benefits, or help from acquaintances. Some arrive because they heard stories about opportunity, warmer weather, or a fresh start. And some come because they have nowhere else left to try. A ticket to Hawaii can feel like more than transportation. It can feel like a reset button. For someone stuck in a painful, collapsing life on the mainland, the islands can seem like a place where reinvention is still possible. Who would not be tempted by the promise of a new beginning? Who would not look at a place of breathtaking beauty and imagine that maybe, just maybe, life could turn around there? But reality has a way of confronting hope almost immediately. Jobs do exist, especially in tourism. Hotels, restaurants, maintenance, landscaping, seasonal work, hospitality services. On paper, it seems like a place with enough work to offer a foothold. And for a short time, that foothold may feel real. A few shifts, a paycheck, a borrowed room, a sense that things are finally moving in the right direction. But then comes the obstacle that swallows everything else. Housing. Rent in Hawaii is among the highest in the country. Even a small room can cost more than a full apartment elsewhere. The cost of living bites into every paycheck. Groceries are expensive. Transportation is expensive. Utilities are expensive. The daily math becomes brutal, because even full-time work does not always mean stability. What happens when the paycheck comes, but the rent is still too high? What happens when one missed shift becomes one missed payment, and one missed payment becomes one eviction, and one eviction becomes a tent? That is how the cycle begins. Instead of bringing people in, the state also has programs designed to help some leave. If a person has family or support on the mainland, they may be offered assistance to return, sometimes even a plane ticket. Since 2015, hundreds have used these programs to start over elsewhere. For some, that return can be a relief. A chance to reconnect with relatives. A possibility of cheaper housing. A more familiar support system. But is leaving always the same as solving? And what happens when a person is sent back to the mainland without the deeper stability they were missing in the first place? Because that is the catch. It does not always solve the problem. And that brings us to the deeper, almost uncomfortable truth behind the entire story. Hawaii represents two completely different realities at once. On one side, it is a global symbol of beauty, relaxation, and escape. It is where people go to celebrate weddings, anniversaries, dream vacations, and once-in-a-lifetime trips. It is the place people imagine when they think of paradise. On the other side, it is a place where thousands struggle every day just to survive. Tents on beaches. Makeshift homes near paradise. Families trying to protect children from uncertainty. Elderly people sleeping in cars. Workers living one crisis away from losing everything. A contradiction so sharp it almost feels impossible to hold in the same mind. And yet both realities are true. So let me leave you with this. What happens when a place built on dreams becomes a destination for desperation? And perhaps more importantly, what does it say about the wider world when people keep arriving at a place like Hawaii not because they are chasing luxury, but because they are chasing hope? Is this really just an island story, or is it a mirror reflecting something much larger happening across society? Rising costs, fragile support systems, and millions of people living closer to the edge than most are willing to admit? Because in the end, this is not only a story about one island. It is a story about rising costs, fragile systems, and people searching, sometimes desperately, for a second chance. It is about the distance between the image of paradise and the reality of survival. It is about what happens when hope collides with economics. And it is about how easily a beautiful place can become a battleground for the most basic human need, a safe place to live. And despite everything, they keep coming. Because for some, even now, Hawaii still feels like hope.